And bearing in mind what we have already seen, is it surprising to us that Saul's going to fail in the test that he has? The first test that we see, it's going to come right quickly. Over in 1 Samuel chapter 14. This is a story we're all familiar with. Now Saul has started, this is about 2 years into his kingdom, he has started to raid the Philistines. He has decided, God has told me to deliver the people, and that's what I'm going to do. And so he starts off with a campaign. He calls about 3,000 men to himself, a small group, and he's going to attack some of the Philistine outposts. Well, the Philistines don't like this. And as a result of that, they get together about 30,000 men, and they're going to come up against Saul. And Saul all of a sudden realizes that he has really overplayed his hand. Because he's put his trust in his own ability to mastermind a rebellion, but he hasn't thought some things through. And he finds himself in a situation in chapter 14. If you read with me beginning in verse 5, excuse me. I think I've got us again. I'm sorry. I think I got us in the wrong chapter again. Chapter 13, verse 5. I'm flipping through so many chapters, and you can already see where my editing needs work. Chapter 13, verse 5, it says, the Philistines mustered to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops like the sand on the seashore in multitude. They came up and encamped in Michmash to the east of Bethaven. And when the men of Israel saw that they were in trouble, for the people were hard pressed, the people hid themselves in caves and in holes and in rocks and in tombs and in cisterns. And some Hebrews crossed the fords of Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. And Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him, trembling. He waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering here to me and the peace offering." And he offered the burnt offering. And as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Samuel went out to meet him and greet him, and Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "When I saw that people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord God has commanded you." Notice the language. When Samuel comes out, and it's worth noting here, we read this passage, and there's nothing specifically that says that Saul actually was the one who offered the sacrifice himself. But there seems to be an implication that something had happened, that Saul had clearly overstepped his bounds. And not only that, we're not told how long on that last day Saul waited for Samuel to show up, but clearly it was about an hour or two too short, because Samuel shows up in the allotted time. He comes up exactly when he said he would, but Saul on that last day sees the people leaving, sees his forces starting to disintegrate, and he knows he has to do something, and so he says, notice his words, "I forced myself." We might say today, "I stepped up." He's gonna justify himself, for Samuel said, "I made the tough decision. I made the call. I did what I had to do." That's going to be Saul's reaction in a lot of instances. And as a result of that, now, it can be a little confusing here. Samuel tells him that now the kingdom is going to be taken from him. Now, he's going to say this again, something similar in chapter 15. What we're seeing now is that Saul is being told, you would have been set up forever as your king, but now because you have refused to do that, your kingdom, in other words, your reign is not going to extend. Your sons will never reign. Your progeny will not sit on the throne. As a result of that, God's not going to build his kingdom on someone who is not going to seek after God's heart. As a result of that, we see what happens here. Saul refuses to trust in the prophecies that God has given him. He said, "I am going to deliver Israel by your hand through my power." But Saul's been looking at this a very military way. He's thinking it strategically, and we're going to see in chapter 14, in the next chapter, that not everybody's looking at this, and when they stop looking at this as a military action and start looking at it as deliverance from God, things are going to change very quickly. But as a result of this, if you remember the state of, if you're reading chapter 13, where Israel's army is right now, the Philistines have basically taken away all the weapons. They won't even allow the Israelites to sharpen their weapons. They won't let them do anything. They have to go to the Philistines to do all of that. They have no army. They have no swords, they have no shields, any of those things. Now Saul has decided to trust himself on their military might without understanding that they have no military might in which to trust. And yet God has promised he's going to deliver them. So now as a result of that, Saul's plan did not focus on God's deliverance. It focused on his own strength, and his own strength was inadequate. And as a result of that, if you read in verse 15 of chapter 13, his whole intention was to keep the army together, but as a result of this, his army is now dwindled to a few hundred people. So he is now put in a position where, because he saw sacrifice as a ritual rather than a command to obey. That's really how he looked at the sacrifice. I'm not sacrificing to God because I need God's blessing. I'm sacrificing because that's something that the people will rally around, and maybe I can get them to stay if I'll do that. We see examples of men of God rallying God's people not by doing some sort of ritual, but by appealing to them based on their own faith. We're going to see the righteous kings, men like Hezekiah, men like Jehoshaphat, who, when they appealed to the children of Israel, rallied them and assured them, the Lord your God is with you and he will fight your battles for you. Saul doesn't make those kind of speeches because at his core, Saul doesn't believe it. And we see as a result of that, his religion and his devotion to God seems to be a very empty thing. It is used as a tool rather than observed as a state of the heart. And that's why Saul fails his test. Test 2. Now, this is all set up because in the next chapter, Jonathan, Saul's son, basically shows Saul exactly how this should be done. Because Jonathan realized the Lord is with us. The Lord has promised to deliver us. And he says to his armor bearer, come with me, we're going to go down. And by himself, with his armor bearer, through the power of God, Jonathan begins to put the Philistines to rest. So despite all of Saul's mismanagement, this battle is now going to turn in Saul's favor. And frankly, this is going to be the pattern that we're going to see throughout Saul's reign. We're going to see examples of Saul sitting on the sidelines, waiting, worrying, not being sure what to do, where someone finally stands up and says, God is with us, we're not going to wait. And we're going to see this with Jonathan, and we're going to see it later on with David and Goliath. Because Saul is going to be hesitant. But once the battle turns, it's interesting in this story, and again, we're not going to read it. If you read through chapter 14, they hear a stir in the camp, and Saul wonders what's going on. Clearly, somebody has gone out to fight without permission. And so he calls the priests, and they're going to consult the Urim and the Thummim. Those are basically the dice, or whatever you want to call those, that they used to divine God's will. But before they even get through this, he hears the commotion getting louder and louder, and he realizes that the battle has already been joined, and God is already fighting on their behalf. And they end up joining the fray. And the battle at this point is already won. So what does Saul do? Well, Saul decides that it's time for him as the king to save face. And we see exactly that's what's going to happen. In verse 24 of chapter 14, we see Saul standing up in a battle that he had nothing to do with. Now saying, and the men of Israel, he says in verse 24, the men of Israel had been hard pressed on the day, so Saul had laid an oath on the people, saying, cursed be the man who eats food until it's evening, and I am avenged on my enemies. All of a sudden now this is going to be about me conquering. I'm going to shift the focus away from Jonathan, away from God, and put it on myself. And he goes on and says in verse 25, now when all the people came to the forest, behold, there was honey on the ground, and when the people entered the forest, behold, the honey was dropping, but no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with the oath, so he put out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb, and put his hand to his mouth, and said, and his eyes became bright. Then one of the people said, your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, cursed be the man who eats food this day, and the people were faint. Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright, because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoils of their enemies that they found, for now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great. So, as we continue, we're going to read this whole passage, but we see later on the consequence of Saul's oath. Because what's going to happen? Well, they get to the end of the day, and Saul wants to keep going. He wants to keep pressing the attack. The people are tired, and he's ready to go, but the priests say, well, let's check with God. Let's consult with God to see what happens. Notice Saul, now that the battle is winning, now that things are going, he's completely forgotten about the idea of checking with God. That's no longer a problem. I've got this under control. My strength is sufficient. We're going to finish this battle. So what happens? There's no response. And so Saul, again, attempting, I think, to save faith, to project this idea of strength, and says, who is it that has sinned? We're going to find out exactly what the problem is here, even if it is my own son Jonathan, even if it is from my own house, whoever has done this will surely die. And as a result of that, of course, he even starts with, I'm going to draw a line in the sand. Here's me and here's Jonathan on one side. And here's everybody else on the other side. It has to be one of you people. It's not my fault. The reason that God is upset can't be about me. We see the attitude that's already being oppressed here. The important thing is that somebody's to blame here, and it's not me. And yet it turned out the lots fell on his side. And so now it's between him and Jonathan. And the lots fall on Jonathan. And what is Saul's response? Saul says, let's go down to verse 36. Actually, you know what? Let's skip ahead. Verse 43, it says, and Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you've done. And Jonathan told him, I tasted a little honey with the tip of the staff that is in my hand. Here I am, I will die. And Saul said, God do so to me and more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan. Then the people said to Saul, shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. See, even the people are starting to understand that something's not right here. But Saul's focus here is to justify himself. And even though it comes to the point of Jonathan being put to death for an oath that he should never have given, that he had no right to author, to a man who innocently violated that oath, he's going to die. Because it can't be my fault. It's got to be my son's fault. Now, the Urim and the Thummim point out that Jonathan was the cause for God not answering, but it doesn't say that he was guilty. In fact, the guilty person of this was Saul. Because Saul was the one that caused all of this problem, all of this issue, all because of his ego, all because of his, well, it wasn't even his ego, but because of his insecurity that required that he be the one, that he be the center, that he be the focus, that his vengeance be addressed. So an oath that was intended to show his strength ends up revealing his weakness of character. And it's not until the people themselves say, we recognize that Jonathan has been working with God, that Saul relents. But you notice that there's no indication that Saul ever indicates, you know what, I was right. You're right. I shouldn't have done what I did. That was a mistake. That's going to be a pattern too. We don't seem to see a whole lot of doubt in Saul in terms of questioning his own rightness, his own fault in certain things. And finally, we're going to get to test number 3. And this is in chapter 15. And this is the one we probably are the most familiar with. And I think in a lot of ways it's the most telling. Because in chapter 15, beginning in verse 1 through 3, it says, Then Samuel said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus said the Lord of hosts, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote them to destruction, all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Now, so this is not, there are times, and we read about this, for example, Deuteronomy 6:10 and Joshua 11:14, the idea that God is going to send them into plunder. You're going to live in houses that you do not build. You're going to harvest vineyards that you did not plant. You're going to have all the spoils, and I'm going to enrich you in the land. But that's not what's going on here. God says, I have justice to mete out on these people. They deserve to die, and I want to make a statement. And we see examples of this, that God says, you're not going to benefit off this. I don't want anyone to benefit off what I'm about to do to these people, because it has been as a sign to the nations around and to you as well that you do not benefit by sinning against the Lord your God. I want them destroyed. I want everything taken out of the way. And he's very clear about this. But we see that in the execution of this, Saul kind of loses sight of this. And we're given a hint of this even before we get to the conversation that we all remember between Samuel and Saul. Over in verse 12, as Samuel hears about this, notice what he's told. And Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning, and it was told Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself, and turned and passed on, and went down to Gilgal. Saul was feeling pretty good about this victory. what he had done, what he had accomplished. And you can already starting to see the idea that Saul is seeing that this wonderful success is a mark of God's approval of me, his stamp of approval on all that I have done. The problem is, who does the king serve? Who is Saul supposed to be serving? Is it himself? Is it the people? Is it his own ego? Is it his own purpose? What does Samuel tell him? In verse 14, Samuel says, "What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen that I hear?" And Saul said, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God. And the rest we have devoted to destruction." We've utterly destroyed them except for these things. That's, you can't utterly destroy something but holding something back. That is a dishonest answer by Saul, because he knows what he did was wrong. He knows he didn't do what he was told to do. And Samuel says in verse 16, "Stop. I will tell you what the Lord said unto me this night." You can just see the frustration that has been building in Samuel. And he finally says, just don't talk. Just listen to me. He says, "Though you are little in your own eyes, you are not the head of the tribe. Are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go, devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord?" You were given, as we say, you were given one job. And you were given a role as king of Israel, and you're not there to serve yourself. You're not there to serve your people. You are there as an instrument of God to do God's will, and God told you to go do this. Now, why didn't you do it? And of course, what does Saul do? Well, he justifies himself. Well, the people told me. The people told me to do this. And he says, well, we just did these to sacrifice. I don't think anybody believes that they did this so that they could sacrifice anything to God. And maybe that, even if it were true, it doesn't matter. The fact is, he was commanded to destroy everything, and he didn't do it. And he finally admits in chapter 24, "I did this, why? Because I feared the people. I was concerned what they would say." There's all this perfectly good stuff. We have an opportunity, and now we're just going to let it all go to waste. And I knew people would be upset about it, and so I did what they asked me to do rather than doing what God had asked him to do. Saul's choice here cost him his rule. And it cost him his standing with God. Now it's not even about your lineage. Now it's about you. Because in verse 28, Samuel tells him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you." That must have been a cutting remark. Somebody who's better than you, because you have failed in everything that you've done. You can see the anger of Samuel in this, but you can also see the anger of God, because Saul, by continuing to rebel against God, continuing to do his will, or the people's will rather than God's, we see that Saul, because of his impulse and his desire to win favor, again, this goes back to what we saw from the very beginning. Saul wants to be a peacemaker. Saul wants to pull people together. Saul wants everybody to be on the same page. Sometimes doing that means giving the people what they want, and God says that's not your job. Your job as the leader of my people is to do my will, not to do the will of the people. And as a result of that, he's trying to show graciousness, and he has now been blinded to the commands of God. And so we see, and this isn't really a test, but it's the idea of what happens as a result of that. And we see as it plays out, and I'll kind of skim through some of these things because we know the rest of the story. We know that now God is going to go, and through Samuel is going to anoint David as king, and he's going to bring him forward. But in all this time, there's something that's missing in Saul's response to all of this. And in chapter 15, verse 30, his initial response to Samuel in this, what does he say? "I have sinned, yet honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel, and return with me that I may bow before the Lord your God." Does this strike you as a penitent attitude? Does this strike you as someone who has been condemned of sin before God, and his concern is, I want to fix that, I want to be right with God, I need God to forgive me? Or is he now saying, look, I get that I sinned, but can you just, don't tell the people? Because what Saul's concerned about is not how God sees him. Saul's concerned about how the people see him. There's no repentance here from Saul. And what is striking about Saul's history, and as we read the rest of this story, that even knowing what God has condemned him for, even knowing the consequences of everything that he is going to be going through, he refuses to turn back to God. Even Ahab, remember the story of Ahab, as bad as he was, as corrupt as he was, When he was confronted finally with what was going to happen to him, what did he do? He humbled himself before God to the point where God said, you see how Ahab has humbled himself? I will bring about destruction, but not during his day. Do you think that Saul could have shown contrition? Could have turned back and said, I repent of this. I'm sorry. I'm going to do better. I'm going to change. And yet he doesn't do that because that's not what he's concerned about. And we see as this story goes on, and we're not going to get, because now, again, we're familiar with the story and there's a lot more to it, but we'll see the pattern playing out over and over throughout the rest of Saul's life, that he is now in open rebellion against God because he sees in David the man that he is going to set up as king. He knows that he's the rightful king of Israel, and what does he do? Well, in chapter 8, we see that he marries him off to his daughter to use her as a snare, to try to entrap him. We see that he's going to attempt to murder David on multiple occasions in chapter 19. We see, in fact, in chapter 22, when he finds that the high priest has helped David, he murders the entire company, the entire family of the high priest. Is this even a recognizable person to what we saw back in 1 Samuel chapter 9? Saul's a different man now. His iniquity and his sin has caused him to be driven to a complete and open rebellion against God. We see him continually pursuing David, even after David spares his life, and even in the end. All the way over, and we're not going to read in chapter 28. If you remember, one of the good things about Saul was that he cast out all the seers out of Israel. Remember that? It's mentioned very briefly in chapter 28. It really is a fact of irony that now in the end of his days, when Saul is facing extinction, and he knows it, he knows that he has been appointed to death, and he's desperate to find a way to change it. Where does he go? Well, Samuel's died, so he goes to the witch of Endor and asks her to raise Samuel from the dead so he can speak to Samuel. Isn't it amazing to you when we think about the way that Saul, in his ever-growing desperation, adamantly refuses to reach out to God? He refuses to ask for repentance. He refuses to ask for forgiveness. He will not turn back, even in all this. And it is amazing, like, for example, and I'll give you an example here in when he's talking to David. This comes out in 1 Samuel 24. This is when the first time that Saul has tried to kill David and David spares his life. This is what Saul says to David. It says, as soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, is this your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And he said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, and that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For a man find his enemy, will he not let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now, behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. Think about the level of obstinance for a man to say this, but I'm not letting go of my throne. I am not giving up my kingdom. I am not going to submit. I'm going to go down fighting, and I know that I'm going to lose, but I don't care. I will not give up my throne. That is the nature of Saul at this point. He has completely turned his back on any, and it may very well be that he thought, I'm beyond redemption. God has spoken. It's all over. There's no hope for me anymore. But he's completely turned his back on the opportunity to serve God. And this all goes back to what we saw from the very beginning, because Saul in his own eyes saw himself in chapter 9 verse 21 as insignificant. But the problem is, rather than having the humility to say, as Paul said, that when I am weak yet I am strong, why? Because God is with me. Saul doesn't look to God as a source of strength, and he never does. Not throughout his entire kingship. As a result of that, he has no faith to lean on him. We see as a result Saul being a fearful and a hesitant general in all that he does. We see a ruler that's more concerned with appeasing the people than he is with doing God's will. We see a strategist with no patience to wait for the guidance of God because he doesn't trust that guidance. We see a Hebrew who saw religion as a tool for motivation but not for change. Not anything that should actually impact my life. And we see a stubborn king who finds fault everywhere but himself. And an unwillingness to turn back to God, because Saul sought the Lord's blessings, but he did not seek the Lord.